opening up the queen and bishop. This thrust immediately contests the center and signals aggressive intentions. A flexible defense, preparing to contest the center with a pawn. Daringly seizing central space. White immediately challenges black's pawn structure and initiates an aggressive pawn confrontation. Challenging the center immediately, black seizes initiative and prepares for active piece play. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces the d4 pawn, preparing for an active central presence. Developing a knight towards the center. This move prepares for central pawn tension and potential counterplay. Challenging black's knight here creates immediate central tension and aims to disrupt coordination. Black chooses to embrace the tension, opening lines and inviting piece play rather than maintaining a cramped pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn, white centralizes the knight while maintaining pressure on black's structure. Developing the bishop to a natural square prepares for castling and helps control the center. Sacrificing the bishop here opens up black's kingside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. This move is less about immediate material gain and more about initiating a positional squeeze. Observe how the dark squares around black's king might become a target. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop now establishes a harmonious pawn structure, though it cedes the bishop pair, potentially opening avenues for white's central control and development. Developing the knight to its natural outpost on f3 prepares castling and reinforces the d4 pawn. A wise step after the pawn structure has been tidied up. Securing the king into a safe haven is a prudent reaction, initiating a phase where both sides will aim to develop their remaining pieces harmoniously. This decision wisely postpones any immediate confrontation, allowing for careful assessment of the evolving pawn structure. Preparing to castle queenside. This maneuver aims to connect the rooks and prepare for an aggressive pawn storm or piece deployment on the kingside. That bishop vacates its key defensive square, preparing to redeploy, but it also opens up a potential diagonal for white's queen toward the kingside. This repositioning allows for potential pressure later but might momentarily leave the king less sheltered. Embracing the queenside, white prepares to castling on the opposite flank, injecting a potent dose of counter-attacking dynamism into the position, with the kings set for a dramatic clash. Unleashing the queen towards the queenside, black initiates a fascinating battle for central control and aims to disrupt white's kingside, castling ambitions by activating a key attacking piece. Re-centralizing the knight after black's queen repositioning offers flexibility, potentially reinforcing the d4 pawn or preparing a swift regrouping for kingside action. The queen embarks on a provocative journey, immediately eyeing the queenside and challenging white's castled king. This aggressive redirection of force aims to disrupt white's coordinated development, creating potential weaknesses around the monarch and forcing white to react rather than pursue their own initiatives. Consider how this queen's newfound liberty might be leveraged for future attacks or create counterplay against white's slightly exposed king. Safeguarding the queenside pawn structure often sets the stage for future queenside expansion, aiming to prevent the opponent from easily infiltrating that flank. Establishing a pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn breaks on the kingside is the underlying aim behind placing the knight here, aiming to free up the c8 bishop's diagonal and solidify the center. Sharpening the attack on the kingside. The bishop pivots to a diagonal that directly threatens the pawn structure around black's castled monarch, while simultaneously eyeing potential outpost squares further up the board. Consolidating the pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside. c6 shores up the knight's advanced position while simultaneously offering the queen a retreat. square should it come under fire. Repositioning the rook to the e-file injects immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed nature of the f6 bishop. Initiating a pawn thrust on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's control and gain space, potentially targeting the bishop on c4 or preparing to swing the rook over to the open files. This aggressive advance creates immediate tension, forcing white to consider the safety of the queenside structure and the potential for queenside counterplay. The move also subtly challenges white's pawn chain on d4 and c3, as black's c6 pawn now has support, enabling this bold sortie. Relocating the bishop to the rim often signals an intent to avoid further exchange pressure or to redeploy for a future queenside assault, perhaps targeting a pawn lever or simply seeking safer squares. Dampening the attacking spirit, qd8 retreats the queen to a less ambitious square, relinquishing the central queenside pressure. This maneuver, while defensively sound by maintaining the pawn chain and avoiding the knight's attack, unfortunately concedes a degree of initiative. The queen's departure from the fifth rank diminishes its ability to support potential pawn breaks, like c5, and its new position on d8 feels somewhat passive, lacking active participation in the unfolding battle for central control or open files. White's development is proceeding smoothly, and black's queen placement here hints at a desire to consolidate rather than contest. Reclaiming central space, this knight aggressively eyes the d6 pawn, a persistent thorn in white's development, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy for potential kingside action should the opportunity arise. It's a dynamic repositioning that seeks to disrupt black's well-knit pawn structure. Black challenges white's queenside expansion by unleashing the a-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's plans and potentially open lines for counterplay. An assertive knight thrust, Nay5 immediately probes for weaknesses around black's castled king, aiming to exploit the now weakened f7 square and potentially create tactical opportunities. The queen gracefully retreats, preparing for a potential pawn storm on the queenside and avoiding the immediate pressure on the d5 square after the knight's bold advance. Initiating an aggressive pawn storm with f4 signals white's intent to seize space and disrupt black's harmonious development, though it does create a latent weakness on the e4 square and potentially opens up lines for black's counterplay if not handled precisely. A thoughtful repositioning of the rook, aiming to contest the semi-open b-file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside, while also safeguarding the structure against white's encroaching knight. Unleashing the bishop from its protective pawn shield, white aims to reintegrate it into the central fray, eyeing potential pressure along the long diagonal and preparing for a more active role in the unfolding positional battle. Unleashing a pawn storm, black aims to disrupt white's comfortable kingside position and create immediate queenside threats, forcing a reaction before white can consolidate. Initiating a pawn advance on the queenside, white confronts black's expanding ambition, aiming to curb the queenside pawn majority while simultaneously opening avenues for their own pieces. This proactive stance, though potentially creating a backward pawn on the c-file, forces a positional decision from black. The queenside tension escalates, with white seeking to control key squares and potentially exploit the pawn structure for long-term positional advantage, preventing black from gaining too much space. Shattering the central impasse, black boldly injects immediate dynamic tension, seeking to unravel white's seemingly solid pawn structure. This ambitious advance aims to pry open the queenside and create attacking avenues, potentially exposing the white king on its current castled flank. The strategic gamble is clear. Sacrifice material clarity for active play and exploit the resulting positional imbalances before white can fully consolidate. Unlocking the d-file. This bold advance aims to shatter black's queenside pawn structure and potentially expose their king's sanctuary. A double-edged sword that could unleash unforeseen complications or grant white a powerful central initiative. A bold pawn sacrifice. Accepting the challenge in the center and inviting a sharp, potentially decisive confrontation where the open d-file will become a major battleground. Unleashing the queen to the d-file opens up white's central pawn chain and aims to exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's kingside, particularly if the defender of the g7 square is occupied. Seizing the opportunity, black recaptures the pawn, initiating a tactical sequence that promises to enliven the position. The exchange on e5 is not merely a pawn recapture but a crucial pivot point, aiming to dismantle white's central presence and open lines for black's pieces. Observe how the knight's relocation dramatically alters the pawn structure and the subsequent potential for pawn breaks. This move is a clear signal that black is ready to shed passive defense and engage in a more dynamic struggle. The focus shifts to liberating black's queenside and potentially creating weaknesses in white's otherwise solid pawn shield. It's a calculated risk to invite activity, trusting in the coordination of black's remaining forces. Recapturing the pawn with the queen immediately sharpens the tactical situation, directly challenging black's central pawn structure and opening clear lines for white's remaining pieces to join the fray. The material is now balanced, shifting the battle to piece activity and control of open lines. Black's immediate recapture on e5 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, potentially opening up the king's escape route but also solidifying white's central influence with the d-pawn now advanced and white's queenside expansion potentially stifled by the a-pawn advance. A pawn advances, finally resolving the central pawn tension and opening the f-file for potential battery formation against the castled king. A bold re-engagement of the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the knight on the d6 square, asserting central control after the pawn exchange. This maneuver aims to solidify the d-file and prepare for potential pawn pushes that could open lines against black's somewhat exposed king. Unpinning the bishop and preparing a sortie for the knight, this pawn push now creates a formidable battery on the d-file, aiming to pierce white's somewhat exposed king. Re-establishing piece harmony, the bishop retreats to a more secure square, keeping an eye on the central advance and preparing to participate in the queenside initiative. Initiating a daring central pawn thrust, black liberates the pinned bishop and aims to disrupt white's queenside space advantage, creating dynamic potential. Securing the monarch from potential threats along the long diagonal and preparing for eventual pawn pushes is the primary objective behind this seemingly passive maneuver, allowing for greater flexibility in developing a coherent plan. Bringing the bishop back to the safer square on e6 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to contest the open d-file, aiming to disrupt white's central control and prevent further pawn advances. Initiating an exchange of heavy pieces often signals a transition towards the endgame, and this particular trade aims to simplify white's position while potentially weakening black's pawn structure if the subsequent play is not precise. Reclaiming the central file is a priority, as the newly opened d-file offers excellent scope for the rook to infiltrate white's territory and pressure the pawn structure. The exchange of bishops clears crucial diagonals, potentially liberating the rook on d1 and setting up pressure along the d-file. Opening the f-file for your rook now offers immediate attacking potential, creating a direct avenue towards the enemy king and potentially exploiting the slightly weakened kingside pawn structure. Securing the rook's presence on the second rank opens up crucial defensive possibilities and prepares for potential pawn advances. This pawn thrust unlocks the queenside, seeking to create imbalances and potentially a passed pawn down the c-file, though it also weakens the pawn chain's integrity. Liberating the knight from its compromised diagonal presence aims to redeploy it to a more active post, potentially supporting pawn advances or reinforcing key squares in the center, all while preparing for a more fluid endgame transition. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, Black dramatically alters the spatial landscape, aiming to shatter White's central pawn structure and disrupt their defensive coordination. Reclaiming the central square after that pawn exchange, White aims to activate the knight, swinging it across to a more influential diagonal, potentially eyeing the kingside or supporting a future pawn push, while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 square and preparing for a potential exchange of further pieces if Black wishes to simplify. Unlocking the open d-file for your rook is a promising ambition, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's vulnerabilities, though be mindful of how it exposes your own king's safety to potential checks along the third rank. If White can coordinate effectively, the rook's advance to the third rank solidifies its presence on the open file and prepares to challenge Black's isolated pawn on c3, potentially leading to a simplification that could favor White in the ensuing endgame. The pawn push to b2 drastically alters the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn for Black and potentially exposing White's queenside. This aggressive advance challenges White's entire queenside structure, forcing a re-evaluation of defensive plans and possibly opening lines for Black's rook. The monarch finds a new sanctuary on b2, repositioning to sidestep potential threats from Black's advancing pawn chain and to prepare for a more active role in the ensuing endgame. The bishop retreats, seeking solace on the long diagonal after its foray into enemy territory, now tasked with defending the pawn chain that stretches precariously towards White's king. Injecting life into the queenside pawns, this advance aims to disrupt Black's consolidating structure and potentially create opportunities for the knight to become active on the newly opened diagonal. The pawn sacrifice is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, but it opens a dangerous diagonal towards your king. The monarch is now exposed, a consequence of the pawn structure's collapse, and Black's rook on the d-file will certainly capitalize on this newly opened diagonal. Recognizing the bishop's isolation and the pawn chain's structural integrity, Black seeks to activate its queen's defender, preparing for potential skirmishes along the open files that are beginning to emerge. Bringing the king to the center in this endgame aims to activate its power, as opposed to leaving it passively on the edge. Reactivating the bishop to the queenside opens up the file for potential counterplay and prepares to challenge White's entrenched central pawn structure. The rook's repositioning to the second rank seeks to centralize its influence and potentially support a pawn push later, while simultaneously avoiding the disruptive influence of the Black bishop on the kingside diagonal. Reactivating the king from its passive shelter, the monarch ventures forth, aiming to become a participating piece in the ensuing pawn skirmishes and potentially influence the central structure as White's knights become more restricted in their deployment. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure addresses potential weaknesses, offering a subtle but crucial layer of defense against any immediate Black threats. Mobilizing the king to a more central and active position, seeking opportunities to participate in the pawn struggle or defend against potential threats is crucial as the queens are off the board and a complex pawn structure has emerged. Anchoring the rook here secures the 7th rank, preventing any immediate disruption from the opposing knight or bishop and preparing for potential future pawn pushes on the kingside. The bishop's repositioning to c7 seems to be a cautious regrouping, seeking a safer square after the pawn storm on the queenside in the open files. This square also allows it to potentially support a future advance of the a-pawn, though that seems unlikely given the current material balance and king safety concerns. It avoids the direct attack from the rook on the d-file and maintains some defensive pressure on the center, but frankly, it feels a bit passive and doesn't directly address white's growing influence. The knight's repositioning to c5 now challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to disrupt their coordination and potentially infiltrate the queenside for greater activity. Reclaiming that pawn opens up the bishop, creating active attacking lines and aiming to disrupt white's rook on the 2nd rank, while also preparing to mobilize the king's defenses for potential counterplay in this tense positional battle. Navigating the tangled pawn structure, the knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs and aiming to disrupt black's solidified central presence. Bringing the king into the fray signals an aggressive intent to contest the central squares and potentially create mating threats, but it also exposes the monarch to open lines and tactical skirmishes. Promoting pawn advancement on the kingside now becomes a priority, aiming to disrupt the black king's shelter and gain an active position. Solidifying the pawn structure around the king becomes paramount as the material dwindles. Securing the king's sanctuary often dictates the course of the ensuing endgame. Activating the rook along the open g-file, the player aims to put pressure on black's pinned knight and potentially create threats against the king's flank. Initiating a defensive maneuver, the black king seeks a safer haven away from the active queenside action, a prudent step to avoid becoming a target for white's aggressive pawn push. Initiating a daring knight maneuver, nc5 pierces the queenside defense, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and potentially create passed pawns. Bringing the bishop back to guard the passed pawn creates a static defense, but it surrenders the initiative and allows white's knight to become even more dominant on the queenside, potentially preparing to infiltrate with the king. The knight repositions, seeking a more active square on the queenside to influence the critical central pawn structure and potentially support a queenside advance or pressure black's lightly defended king. This repositioning of the bishop to b4 seeks to activate it on the open diagonal, aiming to challenge white's control over the queenside and potentially harass the pawns. This recapture on the kingside aims to re-establish material balance and potentially simplify the position by trading a pair of minor pieces, but it overlooks the immediate tactical threat of black's knight forking the king and rook on the queenside. The king bravely ventures towards the center, seeking central influence and potential counterplay amidst the otherwise static pawn structure. Activating the rook by bringing it to the 3rd rank aims to challenge the central pawn structure and potentially support advances on the queenside, where black's doubled pawns are now a significant weakness. Embracing the open lines, the rook slides home, seeking a more active post and potentially challenging the isolated pawn on e5. A king that emerges from its protective shell too early often finds itself exposed to the elements. And here, the black monarch, after a brief flirtation with the center, is now staring down a dangerous open file and a determined rook. A cautious consolidation, black opts to reposition the monarch to safety, seeking refuge from the potential storm brewing on the open diagonals. initiating a rook lift to the 4th rank, preparing to contest the open files and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Seeking refuge and active engagement. Placing the bishop on the back rank provides a defensive anchor while eyeing potential counterplay. Along the 3rd rank, the king's exposed position on the edge of the board becomes a glaring weakness now that black's pieces are shifting. The black king, now awkwardly placed in the center, becomes a target for the rook on g4, aiming to exploit the open files. King hunts are often decided by clever maneuvering and creating open lines. And this move is certainly aimed at disrupting the black king's comfort zone by forcing it to move. A critical decision arises for black. Should the king actively seek sanctuary or remain passively defended? Relocating the monarch to the e7 square, as contemplated, offers a slightly more central post, potentially preparing to support pawns on the kingside should white's knight penetrate further. The rook's retreat to the 4th rank aims to redeploy, potentially eyeing the kingside or supporting a pawn advance further down the board, while simultaneously maintaining a watchful eye on the opposing king's current sanctuary. The bishop finds a more active outpost, no longer passively defending the b-pawn and aiming to restrict white's king's mobility on the queenside. Reasserting pressure on the queenside pawn structure with the knight repositions the piece to a more active role, eyeing squares like c4 and e4 while preparing to support a potential kingside advance or defend against any black incursions. Challenging the white king's shelter is the immediate goal, forcing a reaction and potentially opening lines that have been stubbornly shut down. The king bravely ventures into the thick of things, aiming to solidify its position and potentially support a final push, though the surrounding pawns present a rather precarious outlook. The rook's insistent check forces the white king into a perpetual dance, sacrificing a tempo that could be used for vital defensive repositioning. The king's journey to safety takes a decisive turn as it boldly steps forward into the fray, challenging black's exposed pieces and aiming to disrupt any attempts at a perpetual check while simultaneously securing a more active central position. A strategic regrouping is initiated, shifting the bishop to a more central defensive posture, aiming to bolster the king's safety by creating an additional barrier against potential advances. Activating the knight towards the center promises to disrupt black's consolidating position. The bishop repositions, seeking a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing weaknesses on white's kingside or aiming to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces. Focusing the rook to the c-file exerts immediate pressure on black's doubled pawns, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities for white to exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The black rook now solidifies its hold on the 7th rank, indirectly supporting the advance of the bishop on d4 and preparing to contest the crucial central files in the upcoming endgame stages. The monarch embarks on a perilous journey, seeking active participation while leaving its flank exposed, a bold gambit in the closing stages. Repositioning the bishop to e7 offers crucial support for the pawn chain and prepares to contest the open files that white has begun to dominate. Seizing the central files with the king opens up possibilities for rapid deployment and potentially threatens to corner the black bishop. Embracing the opposition, the bishop repositions to actively contest the central squares and potentially disrupt white's coordination, aiming to create more dynamic possibilities in this endgame. Advancing the g-pawn aims to create a crucial outpost for the knight on f3, potentially shoring up the kingside defense and preparing a central advance. Introducing a pawn to the kingside, This h5 maneuver aims to disrupt white's knight and potentially create a pawn majority on the queenside for black. A bold pawn push initiates a potential kingside skirmish, aiming to pry open lines against the beleaguered black monarch. Gaining control of the open files is paramount now. The rooks must find active posts to disrupt white's consolidated pawn structure and challenge their pieces. The king begins a daring journey, venturing into the heart of the battlefield in search of active participation and potential discovery of weaknesses in black's formation. A desperate attempt to inject some life into the position by forcing a king excursion, though it likely only hastens the inevitable pawn munching that white is so eager to begin. This strategic retreat aims to regroup and prepare for a potential king hunt, acknowledging the danger posed by black's active pieces. The black king, after a circuitous journey, finds itself nudged closer to the fray again. A risky proposition given the open files and white's active pieces poised to exploit any weakness. Activating the knight to the central outpost promises to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially create new attacking avenues. The rook's aggressive sortie checks the king, forcing its repositioning and potentially disrupting white's coordination. But it also leaves black's pieces somewhat exposed and could invite counterplay if white can consolidate effectively, initiating a decisive frontal assault, sacrificing tempo for king's safety on the light squares. Seizing the open file is paramount, and the rook now occupies a critical artery for potential breakthroughs. Exploiting the exposed black king, this check forces it back into a more constricted position, aiming to unravel the defensive setup. The black king, forced from its relatively safe square, now finds itself in a precarious position, exposed to potential attacks along the open files and diagonals. This maneuver, steering the rook to the c-file, aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the open diagonals for potential pressure on the king. The rook's aggressive sortie to the first rank, offering a check, seeks to disrupt white's pieces and potentially force concessions, aiming to pry open lines for the black king's safety or activate dormant pieces in a complex endgame scenario. The white king, currently exposed, seeks refuge behind the pawn shield as it initiates a cautious advance towards the center, aiming to bolster its defenses and prepare for a potential kingside push. Grabbing that pawn abandons crucial kingside defense and surrenders the initiative entirely, allowing white's rook to infiltrate and cause havoc. A decisive check disrupting the opponent's defensive formation and forcing immediate tactical concessions. The king, exposed after a long journey, now finds itself in a precarious position, directly in the path of the advancing knight's check. Initiating a king hunt with a timely knight check forces the opponent's monarch into a more exposed position, aiming to exploit its current static vulnerability and potentially open lines for an attack. The knight's retreat opens up the possibility of a final mating net. Black must now be incredibly precise to avoid allowing white's rook to become a decisive attacking piece. The knight repositions, aiming to reclaim central influence and prepare a potential fork on the c-file, while simultaneously guarding against any immediate threats to white's king. A final aggressive surge from the rook, aiming to dislodge the enemy king from its defensive sanctuary, though the pawn structure on the queenside might prove a formidable barrier to any lasting gains. The monarch bravely steps into the fray, seeking to connect with the remaining forces and perhaps support a pawn push. But its proximity to the enemy rook could prove perilous in the ensuing skirmishes. The king, now exposed on c7, becomes a significant target as the rooks remain passive. The capture on c5 directly addresses the immediate check, simplifying the position while maintaining the initiative and forcing black's bishop back. The rook sacrifice aims to disrupt white's king safety by forcing an exchange and opening lines. But it leaves black's monarch exposed to a devastating discovered attack. Securing the flank pawn stabilizes white's material advantage, transforming the remaining struggle into a technical grind where black's passed pawn is a distant dream against the coordinated white pieces. A desperate attempt to create counterplay. This pawn push aims to disrupt white's newly organized army and potentially distract the king. But it overextends and opens itself to immediate refutation. The king boldly marches forward, venturing into the heart of the pawn storm to support the rook's advance and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. The black king, now completely exposed after white's rook retreat, finds itself cornered and vulnerable to the immediate threat of a checkmate that looms with the knight's potential repositioning to a checking square, forcing black into a defensive scramble rather than an offensive pursuit. The king's audacious march to the center, though risky, now aims to support the pawn push while keeping an eye on the potential passed pawn on the a file. The black king ventures out, seeking activity, but potentially exposing itself to further threats on the open diagonals. The white king ventures forward, seeking to influence the center and potentially support a kingside pawn push. A bold but potentially risky foray into open territory given the remaining material on the board. Stepping into the light, the black king endeavors to activate itself, seeking to participate more directly in the unfolding endgame dynamics, a crucial step in converting the pawn advantage. The king, no longer safe on the third rank, now seeks refuge on the queenside, aiming to escape the immediate threats and become an active participant in the endgame. The rook now swings across to the kingside, aiming to dislodge the troublesome knight and potentially create passed pawns or open lines for counterplay, closing the net on that black rook, forcing it back and consolidating the material advantage. The pawn pushes forward, aiming to create a passed pawn and potentially disrupt white's defensive setup. But it also exposes the king further and opens lines for counterplay. Unleashing a pawn towards the queenside forces black to confront immediate space limitations. The rook's intrusion along the open file forces the king to abandon its temporary safety, creating an immediate threat of checkmate and disrupting any defensive cohesion white might have hoped for. The king bravely steps into the fray, seeking shelter and offering an escape route while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure. Securing the rook's position on the 7th rank promises to disrupt white's pawn structure and create further avenues for counterplay.